This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. You are listening to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Since 2017, I have talked to professors, authors, teachers, journalists, practitioners, and scholars about all things related to religion. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Corwin Malcolm Davis to the show. Corwin Malcolm Davis is a PhD candidate at Emory University in Person, Community, and Religious Life, and is earning a certificate in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Davis earned a BA degree from Belmont University and an M.Div from Vanderbilt University Divinity School as the Dean's Scholar. At Emory, Davis received the George W. Woodruff Fellowship, the Centennial Scholars Fellowship, and externally fellowships from the Louisville Institute and the Forum for Theological Exploration. His work has also been recognized in scholarship through the receipt of Emory's 2022 Studies in Sexualities Graduate Award and in public writing through features in literary publications such as Columbia Journal. On this episode, we discuss the basics of practical theology, bottom-up leadership in faith communities, his article, A Great Camp Meeting, Meditating on the Black Faiths of Our Children, and more. You can find him online at corwinmalcolm.com. Thank you so much for listening. Corwin Malcolm Davis, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thanks, Gregory. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here as well. I'm wondering if we can start off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So my name is Corwin. I'm a current PhD candidate at Emory in the Graduate Department of Religion. I'm also pursuing a certificate in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. So a lot of my research, it's kind of housed in religion, but it takes a lot of influence from gender and sexuality, from critical race, from Black studies, and brings them all into conversation together, which is a nice emerging field of scholarship. And I'm also an ordained clergy person in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, where I've served as a pastor and currently serve as an associate pastor at a church in Harlem and participate on the denominational level in different ways. I lean into a good balance of scholar and practitioner, some days more one side than the other, it seems.
That is so cool. I'd love to know a little bit about those two paths you're on. I want to know a little bit about pastoring, and I also want to know your academic path. Let's start with the pastoring side. Tell me a little bit about that path that you've traveled through your life, some major turning points that you may have stumbled upon along the way that led you into deciding to pursue pastoring and staying involved in it.
I'm a third generation clergy person. So, I mean, in some ways it was there from birth, whether I wanted it to be or not. My father and grandfather are both clergy people, and both have served in ministry my whole life. So I was raised in the church, and even as a child, was preaching to my stuffed animals. I did not intend, however, that it would go that way. When I was going through high school, I was very much into music. I was a choral conductor. I started undergrad as a music education major in classical
Awesome.
vocal. However, we might want to define a call I experienced when I was in undergrad. And so I ended up switching to studying religion then. And then and I was at Belmont University, which is, a music school, which is why I was there. Then I said, well, I guess I need to go to seminary. So I went to Vanderbilt down the road in Nashville. And even at Vanderbilt, did not intend on pursuing anything with the academy. I didn't even realize that was an option. I was going to Vanderbilt to go into congregational ministry. A seminary degree is a requirement in our denomination for ordination. So I just was getting, my degree. And then it was while I was at Vanderbilt, I was ordained, served in different ministry capacities. And then through conversations, through courses, through interactions with faculty there, started to see that academia might be also a passion or a desire, and then stumbled my way into a PhD and have since kind of been figuring out, how to balance both.
Amazing. What role does music play in your life now? Are you still doing anything involved in music on the side too?
Not as much as I'd like, but I think it shows up in different ways in my writing, and in the research. I look a lot at the arts broadly, and their connection to music. I mean, their connection to religion. So that's why it's kind of showing up now, is exploring some of those hidden connections, or for a lot of people, they're very easily visible connections. But we'll see. We'll see what the path brings later on.
Awesome. Well, what I want to know now is in your PhD at Emory, how did you kind of figure out what it was that you wanted to do, what you wanted to focus in on for like an actual PhD course of study? How did you, find your way academically?
That's a great question, because I applied to PhDs 2 years in a row. The very first year I applied to programs, I was applying for religion in the Americas, or kind of like American religious history. Because like I said a minute ago, I'm really interested in a lot of Black studies, which a good portion of it is historical. I'm interested in gender and sexuality and these kind of things that deal a lot with the archives. So I assumed I would do that. I applied to 4 schools and got rejections from all 4.
Hmm.
And, admittedly was very stunned, because I was a great student. I had a very top GPA. I'd won these awards at Vanderbilt. Even my advisor was really shocked. But it's when I sat down with the then dean at Vanderbilt, Emily Towns, we were going through my transcript from Vanderbilt, and she just kept looking, and she said, practical theology, practical theology, practical theology. All your courses, all your electives were in practical theology.
Hmm.
Why did you apply for a PhD in religious history? I still don't quite know why I did, but I took sage advice, and the next year applied for practical theology, which, even as I was writing the application, was affording me the opportunity to articulate my interests in a different way. And that year I applied to 6 schools, and I was offered admission to 5.
Wow.
So it was a really clear turnaround for me, and helped me to discern that that was really the area of study I wanted to be in. But yeah, it certainly came with trial and error on the early part.
Well, that's great. I mean, it was kind of a blessing in disguise then, getting rejected from the one that maybe you didn't wasn't right for you. You know what I mean? Like I know what that feels like as well in my own life, to kind of stumble your way into something and just have it not work out, and then find your what you really are meant to be doing later on. Like I went into a PhD program that I just kind of winged it, got accepted to, did it, did it for 2 years, and then flopped big time. But then I took another job doing something different at a school, and then found my way into this religious studies stuff. And I was like, ah, man, if I only would have known I liked this when I was in that PhD program, I would have actually been successful, you
Oh
know?
yeah, yeah.
So, as somebody who went into the wrong thing, I am so happy for you that you didn't wind up in that position, because this is so much better. So, you mentioned practical theology, right?
Mhm,
I do want to talk about an article that you've done, but first, let's dive into that term because it's going to set the stage for this article too.
mhm.
You are described as a practical theologian. Tell me a bit about this term and what practical theology is.
So I first want to say, just kind of as an aside, that in many ways I try to resist disciplinarity in its strictest forms, because
Sure.
so much of our work, it's just it's over everything, and we
Hmm.
include so many different disciplines. However, in order to be marketable and legible, you do have to hang your hat somewhere. So I hang my hat in practical theology, which, the best way to describe it really is that it's rooted in practice. This is a very generalized kind of explanation, but if you think of like systematic theology or theology proper as kind of top down, practical theology is bottom up.
Mm,
So systematic theology may say, well, here's what we believe about this theory or this theology. Here's what we believe about baptism or what we believe about salvation.
hmm
And then that kind of impacts church doctrine, church practice, theological discourse, kind of trickling down.
Sure.
Practical theology goes the opposite direction. And again, this is an oversimplification, but practical theology starts at what people are doing, starts at the practices, starts at the lived experiences of religion, and then kind of mines from that a theology. So rather than saying this is what we believe about baptism, a practical theologian would say, well, how are people practicing baptism? Because
Mm.
that's going to show more about what they actually believe. Or how are they practicing, for my area, pastoral or spiritual care? And then kind of crafting a theology from the lived experience, from the practices and rituals of people who are doing religion.
Mm.
Um, and it is still theology. We're still kind of taking it and crafting something that's descriptive as well as prescriptive. But we are doing it in a way that I think at its best is in conversation with practitioners and in conversation with communities of faith who are figuring it out kind of on the ground.
Yeah, you know what that means to me whenever I'm listening to what you're saying about the top down versus the bottom up is that if it comes from top down and I have a personal disagreement or problem with something that comes from top down, it means that I might find myself incompatible with that community.
Mhm.
Whereas if I'm seeing something that is bottom up, my view is being taken into consideration. And even if I don't gel with it perfectly, it makes me feel like I have more of a stake in the
Yeah.
community instead of being like, well, this thing is being told to me and I can't really reconcile that. So maybe I don't belong. But if I'm seeing somebody acknowledge what I believe, I'm seeing what the bottom up is, I'm contributing to the conversation. Maybe I have a chance of moving the needle in a direction that makes me feel like I can still stay involved in the community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what you point toward too is that in practical theology, and this happens too, in systematics, is a clearer view of the disagreements and the tensions, the liminal spaces. Because if you're interviewing 10 people, you're not going to get 10 people who agree. You're going to get at least 10 different responses.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of automatically thrusted into all of the what seem like minute differences. And then from that, you're able to kind of piece together some kind of amalgam of perhaps this is, there are these five core things that everyone agrees on. And then there are these ancillary things that cause some tension.
Mm,
But yeah, even with practical theology, you're never in a community that I'm really, trying not to use church language, which is on one accord, right? That they're not always going to agree.
sure.
And sometimes, though, to me, that produces some of the best scholarship.
Fascinating.
Just to say, yeah, we can all think about care, baptism, salvation, whatever the theology is, or even more real life kind of world news, pop culture examples, right? We can look at the issues of racism or xenophobia or war or violence and realize that in one congregation, you're going to have 12, 15, 20 different responses, but playing with them and kind of sitting with the tensions and how they still relate to one another despite their tensions, how they still maintain a collectivity, to me is really exciting and gives space for a lot of different theologies to emerge.
So you just said the phrase church language, which really captures my attention because you're doing a PhD, you are a pastor. Does that tension ever like how do you deal with that? Like the academic language versus church language? Like where do you see yourself within those two kind of languages that kind of run parallel to each other?
Yeah. Again, this is somewhat of a generalization, but a lot of practical theologians are practitioners,
Hmm
perhaps more than other disciplines within religious studies. you'll find the majority of practitioners within practical theology, because practical theology tends to be the umbrella at most religion schools, seminaries, divinity schools, for all of the practices of ministry. So preaching, homiletics, pastoral care, Christian education, ritual and liturgics, all of those kind of fall under practical theology. So many of us are accustomed to being practitioners. I think the tension comes when you're trying to connect both communities. Because as much as I believe that the church can benefit from the language and the study of the academy, I equally believe that the academy can benefit from the practices and mores, theologies of the church. So a lot of times it just feels like a tug of war of sorts, where some people might prefer you to kind of be in one camp or the other, but it's really trying as much as possible to bend between the two, and as much as possible to kind of bring them closer and closer together, which some people resist. Some people are welcoming. It changes by the day.
Let's chat a little bit about something that you've written. Whenever we were, getting to know each other a little bit via email, you sent over an article called "A Great Camp Meeting: Meditating on the Black Faiths of Our Children." Tell me a little bit of what this article is about.
So I've been it's interesting. My dissertation itself actually isn't about children. But it's a side passion that I've been writing about since I was at Vanderbilt. Even my master's thesis at Vanderbilt was about the relationship of corporal punishment and religion, particularly for Black American children. And so this article was from a special issue of Religions that was focused on Black faith and Black religion. And I took it as an opportunity to explore more deeply into what a practical theology of children might mean. So much of the way children are treated just in society writ large, but certainly within kind of religious society, is as naive, innocent, ne'er-do-wells. The children are just those who need to be corralled and coerced and disciplined in kind of many different ways, informed into what the adults in these religious communities want them to be, rather than spaces that I believe allow children to live fully and freely as they already are,
Mm-hmm.
as already fully formed beings, as equal parts of the religious community, and then to take seriously what they think and what they believe and how they are grappling with spirituality and culture and all the same questions that I think adults grapple with. But so many assume that children, because of their age, couldn't possibly have anything helpful to say. And
Mm.
I'm just pushing back on that to say, well, maybe there are questions and thoughts that children have that we might actually benefit from listening to.
Well, and you start the article with your own family. You start by mentioning your nieces and your nephew and what they do for you when you're thinking about like big picture stuff in life. Um, do you have any examples that you'd like to point to that really inspire you from within your own life?
I actually wrote a public kind of article. It wasn't an academic piece. It was more like a journal essay for a Columbia journal. And I started that one too with my niece. It was a story of when she got her. I'd never heard of this before, but apparently there's an account through Facebook Messenger that parents can get for their children.
Mm-hmm.
So, kids. Yeah,
Yeah, my daughter has one.
so my sister, got my nieces and nephew one and told us, they have these accounts now. They can call you on their tablets, etc. So one day I'm in my apartment, just chilling, and my niece calls me from her tablet, on like a video call, and she's just in her bunk bed. I mean, just in disarray, but just wanted so badly to talk to her uncle.
Yeah.
She had nothing to talk about. The phone call lasted 2 minutes. That moment made me think, just, even something as simple as that, she wanted to be seen. That's all she wanted. She didn't have anything to say. She just wanted to be seen.
Right.
And she reached out in an attempt to be seen, which, children, her version of that is what adults do every day in a lot of different and perhaps more unhealthy ways. But that was one of the initial moments where I thought, oh, she's doing what we do. We all just want to be seen too. And we just go to different lengths to be seen, but she just wants to be seen and seen as she is, disheveled in her bunk bed, with Disney Channel on in the background.
And that spreads across all facets of life too, you know what I mean? Like there are times when people are very low in their lives and they still need to be seen as well, just to be reassured that in those moments where they're low, like, hey, people still know that I'm out here.
Absolutely. And I think particularly with them, my nieces and nephew are all under the age of 10. So half of their life has been living in the pandemic. And when lockdown began, my oldest niece was in kindergarten. So, I mean, they were spending hours at home learning on computers, and now they're readjusting back to life, in schools, in the building. And so much of what I look at with them is how that experience has shaped their fundamental understanding of the world in ways that even as a practical theologian, there are kind of top-down theologies I can put onto them from 20 years ago that don't work anymore because
Yeah.
their understanding of the world has primarily been influenced by the pandemic. When we were putting on masks in 2020, it was an aberration.
Yeah.
That's what they know. They know masks.
Mhm.
That's why even starting with children and their lived experience is so important because it helps to push back against what we might presume to be universals, and really lean into instead what are particularities, what are contextual pieces of information that are helpful for us, even in just relating to one another.
In the article, so we talked about practical theology a little bit ago, and I feel like that definition and description was wonderful. And the article talks about how practical theology does very well under times of conflict and crisis, which you just brought in with regards to the pandemic as well. What are some of your other favorite examples of the ways that practical theology ties into conflict and crisis and helps it really thrive for people?
One of the, I guess we'll say burgeoning areas, it's been burgeoning for a while, but one of the burgeoning areas in practical theology is trauma. Because again, it's that area of practical theology is that area of religious studies most equipped to respond to the lived experiences. So, I mean, even most people in religious studies who are psychotherapists or counselors, they're in practical theology. And those traumas to me are wide, varied, but they're ways that we sit in the muck with people and try to figure out how they're making sense of things, what they think about God, what they think about community, what they think about institutions. One example that's been I've been obsessing over all week is what's happening right now in New York at Columbia and some other schools. These student protests that are emerging in resistance to what we're seeing happening in Gaza
Hmm.
is a prime example. There's a certain way in which there's a getting in the midst of it that says, okay, in this moment of crisis, which for many, particularly in Gaza, is a moment of trauma. What does it mean to get in there, to sit in these moments, and then to see what's happening, to see what practices are being done, rather than kind of pushing oneself back into the ivory tower to theorize, which theory is important. And am a theorist as well, but I think it's the practical theologian training that would say, well, what's happening at these protests? What's happening with the students? What's motivating them? What's happening to their resistance? What's happening when they are receiving resistance from their administration? What theologies are at play here? What spiritualities are at play? Because in so many of the videos, we're watching people pray. We're watching students gather in circles around Muslim students as they pray. 2 days ago or yesterday, a group from Union Theological Seminary crafted liturgies and prayers and went over, and participated in this kind of protection. So to me, that's the prime source material of practical theology.
Yeah.
On one hand, there's theology proper about, liberation theology or feminist womanist theology, theologies of liberation and relating to oppression. And then there's this lived experience of okay, well, when we're actually in a moment of crisis, when there's violence and war, genocide happening, what are people doing? How are they living this out? And
Mm.
to craft a theology from that, to say, oh, this is what community could look like. This is what living out faith could look like, even when it's risky and dangerous.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, that is absolutely a wonderful description about tying that to what we see every single day in front of our very eyes. Because the conversations around those protests at Columbia recently have been so wide ranging on the news that I know how I feel about the situation, but to see the commentary coming from like the various wings of the media has been just uh it's been slingshotting me all over the place, and it's very confusing. So I appreciate your commentary on that too. That's really helpful to see how spiritual communities can get involved in inter-religious dialogue with regards to conflict and war on the ground level, and do what we can to be involved in something that we really, are limited in our ability to change and fix, but still feel like we have something that we can contribute together as a community whenever we're facing times of crisis. Really
Yeah. And
fantastically well said.
what's helpful too, it gets back to what I was saying a minute ago, there still isn't a unanimous agreement, right? Like you're saying, there's a lot of conflicting opinions, a lot of confusing information. And even on the grounds of Columbia, I was reading an article yesterday where, Columbia faculty were coming out to support their students, to stand kind of as the front lines.
Hmm.
And a faculty member even said, we all don't agree about the students' opinions. We all, even all the faculty, don't share the same opinion. But what we are united in is our view of what is mistreatment from the institution and from NYPD about their ability to protest. And so
Yeah.
even that was a perfect example of kind of those tensions that practical theology minds, which is, yeah, there won't be total agreement. There's still going to be all these different opinions, but even in spite of that, people are willing and trying to show up in these material ways and to still be some type of collective. And that to me is where those points of fascination are.
Yeah.
Where I think so much of perhaps modern culture would say the opposite. Well, we can't show up unless we 100% agree, or we can't, be in community unless there's absolute um, doctrinal, theoretical, theological, agreement. There's another group saying, no, we don't have to fully agree, but because we agree on these things, I'm willing to stand by you. And
Yeah.
that to me is it's prime theological material.
Oh, I love this. I feel like if I was looking for a new spiritual community and I was, going around and like figuring out what community works for me, one of the major questions I would want to know from a leader is this a sort of practical theology within this community or not? You've really kind of opened my eyes to a really interesting way of thinking about spiritual communities in general with regards to involvement and activism and leadership and, community involvement and validating the wide-ranging opinions of the people that are involved in a congregation or community. Really, I'm really just kind of having a great time right now.
Yeah.
So this kind of feel like segues into public scholarship and being involved in conversations in like the wide ranging world. I know that you are involved in a sacred rights cohort, whose goal is to get scholars involved at a wider level in talking about their areas of expertise for a wider audience. Tell me a little bit about your motivation for getting involved in sacred rights and how you found the program so far.
So I have a lot of friends and colleagues who have been or are a part of Sacred Rites. So I've known about them for a while. I was finally motivated to participate almost out of what feels like a necessity, insofar as there are issues that I feel the expertise of various scholars can offer a lot of insight into. And at the same time, we're just not trained, or at least in our academic institutions, to intervene in such public ways. So my interest was, you know, very personal, because even as there are things I can look at and want to make commentary on, want to have insight on, and want to say, oh, but y'all are missing this part, of the conversation. on one side, there's a great apprehension personally in doing so, just out of introversion and kind of self-protection.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there was just a lack of training. Our academic institutions train us primarily to be scholars in the academy.
Mm-hmm.
And so even when one wants to think about public scholarship or writing for a wider audience, those are two completely different skill sets.
Yeah.
And the type of writing that I would submit to an academic journal, it requires a different skill set to translate that into what I would submit for an op-ed.
Mm-hmm.
And Sacred Rights is offering me a lot of training and a lot of helpful insight about how to bridge those connections, while at the same time recognizing that it's the same expertise that undergirds. Like you're not being asked to learn a whole new discipline. You already know the discipline. You already know the theory. It's about how to communicate that theory in ways that are legible and digestible, and accessible for a wider audience.
You mentioned introversion. I relate to that a little bit. I'm a very where you're seeing me sitting right now on camera is kind of where I spend a huge chunk of my
Yeah,
life.
likewise.
And I'm wondering about the risks for you in this. Like, what do you see as like some of the scary aspect of being a very involved public facing scholar?
Yeah, there are two that immediately come to mind. One is, a lot of academic scholars kind of deign public scholarship in some ways. They don't view it as rigorous or um, as, hitting certain demands for what your tenure portfolio requires.
Right.
And so there are some kind of academic temptations to say, well, no, if you only have X amount of hours, you need to spend that time writing your articles and writing your book reviews and doing the stuff for the academy in ways that then pulls you away, at least pulls me away from what I believe is my responsibility to the world beyond the academy. And then on the flip side, there are tensions I have, risks that I feel come from even like religious institutions who are very comfortable in maintaining the status quo and participating even innocuously in systems that benefit them. And so when a scholar, when a thinker, when a minister comes out and says these things don't align, or they have problems particularly that have to do with ethics or justice, there's just always resistance because people want to quell those voices. So those are certainly risks that I continue to grapple with, and to say,
Yeah.
well, if I publish this or if I write this, who's going to call me? Who's going to text me? Who's going to be mad that I gave voice to this elephant in the room? And that comes from kind of both church and academy, which is why I so often kind of get pulled in the middle, because I feel like there's responsibilities to other communities that wouldn't directly identify with either church or academy, but who would benefit from the insights, the theories, the practices that both the church and the academy have to offer.
Yeah, you have a unique tension with regards to public scholarship because you could get feedback from two entirely separate communities and have to process that and then filter it into your reaction into that particular camp. You
Yeah,
know what I mean? And the way that your theological community reacts to something that you write versus how the academic community reacts, you might get two polarizingly different
yeah,
reactions to one piece of work based on the two separate fields that you're involved
absolutely,
in.
absolutely. And that's happened to colleagues of mine. There are particular kind of hot button social issues. I'm thinking, colleagues of mine who have written or talked about sexuality and religion, or those who have written or talked about neoliberalism, kind of critiquing even the church's relationship to the state. And yeah, they've received backlash from both directions. And it's conversations with those colleagues, though, that have been inspiring to me, because despite the backlash that they receive, they still maintain a commitment to doing this work and to believing that these points still need to be made and these conversations still need to be had, and
Yeah.
the backlash, is worth it.
What are some of your goals? What are some of your pie in the sky? I want to do XYZ kind of goals for public scholarship.
this isn't necessarily pie in the sky, but it's, cake on the roof, maybe. It's, I'm thinking about books that I would call public scholarship. I'm thinking about authors like Cole Arthur Riley with Black Liturgies, or even memoirs by K.S.A. Lehman. These books that are
Mm,
public, but they're not screaming, this is public scholarship. But it's just good writing, and it's good writing that helps people to think, and by extension, help people to live, act, or be differently. And I think that's it in church and the academy. There are particular ways, even with my writing, as much as I have to translate what I would write for a journal article into public scholarship, I do that regularly by translating it into sermons or into liturgies. So there's already these kind of different modes of writing, and I think in time, I would really hope that they could all coalesce into a book or a collection that doesn't have to be branded even as this is public scholarship, or this is um, this PhD professor who's teaching you about practical theology, but it just does the work, and the work kind of speaks for itself.
yeah. And I'm thinking about some books like that. Like there's a Bible scholarship by Michael Coogan, or discussions on how religion is taught in public schools by Linda K. Wertheimer.
Mhm.
Elaine Pagels does this stuff
Yeah,
really well. Karen Armstrong, Dwayne Bidwell, Stephen Prothero. Like there's a
yeah,
lot of people who do that kind of work really well, and whose work comes out from like Random House.
yep,
You know
yeah,
what I mean? So like there's really a lot of audience for that kind of stuff too, and those books are amazing and impactful for someone like me who teaches high school, because I need stuff that's accessible for my
yeah.
students, and those people do that kind of stuff great. So I love hearing that be a goal for you as
Yeah.
well.
I think, if I'm thinking of like authors who do that really well, for me, it would be almost like combining bell hooks
Yeah.
with like Barbara Brown Taylor.
Yes.
They're both doing public scholarship. They're both writing from their experience and from their expertise, but in ways that are so accessible, so legible, and it's also just good writing. A lot of scholarship is. I'm the director of the Writing Center for Candler School of Theology at Emory, and one thing I say to my tutors all the time when I'm training them is, there's academic writing and then there's good writing, and they're not always synonymous.
Right.
Bell Hooks, Barbara Brown Taylor, some of those authors you've named, K.S.A. Lehman, they just are good writers,
Sure.
and they've really honed the craft of writing. Because even what you're saying about teaching high schoolers, my siblings and I are first generation college students on
Hmm.
both sides of our family. And I have no doubt that my family are well educated, learned, critical thinkers. That's, this conversation around accessibility happens a lot.
Hmm.
And one of the critiques that people push back is, we are saying these people can't read difficult material. I'm not saying that. I believe they can. For me, I want it to be easy for them to do so. And a lot of academic material, we know how to read it because we have been trained over the years to read it.
Hmm.
So that way, when we see words that to us are a part of our common lexicon, epistemology or soteriology, we just can keep reading. But if
Yeah.
I'm dealing with someone who just has not been exposed to that lexicon in that way, that's going to deter them from engaging. And for me, it's just about what helps the most people engage these ideas.
Yeah. Well, and I interview a lot of professors, grad students, and people who do publish in those types of journals and that kind of writing. And for me, I'm 10 years removed from dropping out of a PhD program, 12 years removed. And so for me, when I get an article like that, what I do is I highlight long passages of it in my PDF reader, and I hit the read, and I get the AI robot voice to read
Yeah,
it to me while I follow along on the screen, and I read it in chunks. I'll read a paragraph, I'll type a question. I'll read a paragraph, I'll type a question. But I need that extra voice because my academic brain is not practiced in that
yeah,
accessibility like you mentioned. So I need an extra layer of support even now, and I've been doing this kind of work for years at this point.
yeah,
So that's kind of how I process the different kinds of writing is I need some extra tools whenever I'm doing that, and I've been doing it for years.
yeah. And when you think about a single mother who works two jobs, or somebody's grandparent who's now taking full ownership of their grandchild.
Yeah.
They don't have time. They just don't have the time to do that labor.
Right.
So for me, I view this kind of work as doing that labor for people ahead of time, to help make it translatable and to help make it accessible.
Well, I love it. Corwin, where can people find your work if they want to kind of follow along with what you're doing, keep up with what you got going on? Is there any places you would suggest people to check out?
Yeah, so my website, corwinmalcolm.com, has some links to writings as well as sermons. And then I'm just at Corwin Malcolm on all social media. And most times if there's writing coming out or even just random thoughts, you can find them there. But yeah, the website, I think, directs you to the most links and other sources.
Well, what a fantastic conversation. Corwin Malcolm Davis, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas and educating me about practical theology. What a great conversation. Thank you so much for being here. I've had a blast.
Thanks, Gregory. It's been a real joy and a delight to be in conversation with you.